Well, I'm Clay Steele, and just like we are every week, and pretty much every night nowadays, here around the campfire, enjoying the heat and the light from the fire, and our friends. And we're making new friends here every time we get together, so it makes it all the better. Tonight I want to read to you some more of the book from Max Brand. The Seventh Man's the title of the book. It's book 3 of the Untamed series. We're on chapter 30. Now y'all find a place to sit, and I'll start out tonight with this story, the continuation of this story. Chapter 30, The Morgan Hills. Once out of Rickett, Barry pulled the stallion back to an easy canter. He'd camped during the latter part of the night near the town and ridden in the morning so that Satan was just full of running. He rebelled now against this easy pace and tossed his head with impatience. No curb restrained him, not even a bit. The light hackamore could not have held him for an instant. But the voice of the rider kept him in hand. Now, out of Rickett's one street, came the thing for which Barry had waited, and delayed his course. A scudding dust cloud. On the top of a rise of ground, he brought Satan to a halt and looked back. Though Black Bart ran in a circle around him and whined anxiously, Bart knew that they should be running. There was no good in that ragged dust cloud. Well, finally he sat down on his haunches and looked his master in the face, quivering with eagerness. The posse, they came closer, at the rate of a racing horse, and near at hand the tufts of dust which tossed up above and behind the riders dissolved, and Whistlin Dan made them out clearly, and more clearly. For one form he looked above all, a big man who rode somewhat slanting. But Vic Gregg was not among the crowd, and for the rest Barry had no wish to come within range of their harm. The revolver at his side, the rifle in his case, were for the seventh man, who must die for Grey Molly. Those who followed him mattered nothing, except that he must not come within their reach. He studied them calmly as they swept nearer, 15 chosen men, as he could tell by their riding, on 15 choice horses, as he could tell by their gait. If they pushed him into a corner, well, 5 men were odds indeed, yet he would not have given them a thought. 10 men made it a grim affair, but still he might have taken the chance. However, 15 men made a battle suicide. He simply must not let them corner him. Particularly 15 such men as these, for in the mountain desert where all the men were raised with a gun in a hand, these were the quickest and the surest marksmen. Each one of them had struck that elusive white ball in motion, and each had done it with a revolver. What could they do with a rifle? That thought might have sent him rushing Satan down the farther slope, but instead he raised his head a little more and began to whistle softly to himself. Satan locked an ear back to listen. Black Bart rose with a muffled growl. The posse rode in clear view now, and at their head was a tall, lean man with the sun glinting now and again on his yellow mustache. He threw out his arm, and the posse scattered towards the left. Obviously, he was the accepted leader, and indeed few men in the mountain desert would not willingly have followed Mark Retherton. Another gesture from Retherton, and at once a dozen guns gleamed and a dozen bullets whizzed perilously close to Barry. Then the reports came barking up to him. He was just a little out of range. Still he lingered for a moment before he turned Satan reluctantly, it seemed, and started him down the far slope, straight away for the Morgan Hills, as old Billy had prophesied. It would be no exercise canter, even for Satan, for the horses which followed were rare of their kind, and the western horse at the worst has manifold fine points. His ancestor is the Barb, or the Arab, which the Spaniards brought with them to Mexico, and the descendants of that finest of equine bloods made up the wild herds which soon roamed the mountain desert to the north. Long famines of winter, hot deserts in the summer, changed their appearance, while their heads grew lumpier and their necks more scraggy, their croups more slanting, Their legs got shorter, but their hooves, they grew denser, hardier. Their shorter couplings gave them greater weight-carrying possibilities. The stout bones and the clean lines of their legs meant speed. And above all, they kept the stout heart of the thoroughbred, and they gained more than this, an indomitable bulldog persistence. The cheapest western cow pony may look like a cartoon of a horse, but he has points which a Judd will note, and he will run a picture horse to death in 3 days. Such were the horses which took the trail of Satan, and they were chosen specimens of their kind. Up the slope they stormed, and there went Satan, skimming across the hollow beneath them. Their blood was his blood. Their courage was his courage. Their endurance his endurance. The difference between them was the difference between the factory machine and the handmade work of art. From his pasterns to his withers, from his hoofs to his croup, every muscle was perfectly designed and perfectly placed for speed. Tireless running, every bone has the maximum of lightness and strength combined. A feather bloom on a steady wind. Such was the gait of Satan. Down the hollow the posse thundered, and up the further slope, and still that black slipped away from him, until Mark Retherton cursed deeply to himself. "Don't race your hosses, boys," he shouted. "Keep 'em in hand. That devil is playing with us." As a result, they checked their mounts to merely a fast gallop, and Barry, looking back, laughed softly with understanding. Far different the laborious pounding of the posse and the light stretch of Satan beneath him. He leaned a little until he could catch the sound of the breathing. Big, steady draughts, with comfortable intervals in between. He could run like this all day, it seemed, and Whistlin Dan ran his fingers luxuriously down the shining neck. Instantly the head tossed up, and a short whinny whipped back to him like a question. Just before them the Morgan Hills jutted up, like stiff mud chopped by the tread of giants. "Now, partner," murmured Barry, "show 'em what you can do. Just lengthen out a bit." The steady breeze from the running sharpened into a gale, whisking about his face. There was no danger of the wave-like rocks of that swinging gallop, but a smooth, swift succession of impulses. Rocks and shrubs darted past, and he felt a gradual settling of the horse beneath him as the strides lengthened. From behind a yell of dismay, and with a backward glance he saw every man of the posse leaning forward and swinging his quirt. An instant later, half a dozen of the ragged little hills closed between them. Once fairly into the heart of the Morgans, he called the stallion back from the racing stride to a long canter, and from the gallop to a rapid trot. For in this broken country it was wearing on an animal to maintain a lope uphill and down the quick jerking falls. The cowpunchers hates the trot, for his ponies are not built for it. But the deep play of Satan's fetlock joints broke the hard impacts. His gait now was hardly more jarring than the flow of the single foot in an ordinary animal. Black Bart, who had been running directly under the nose of the stallion, now skirted away in the lead. Here and there he twisted among the gullies at a racing clip, his head high, and always he picked out the smoothest ground, the easiest rise, and the gentlest descent which lay more or less straight in the line of his master's flight. It cut down the work of the stallion by half, to have this swift, sure scout run before and point out the path. Yet it was stiff labor at the best, and Barry was glad when he came onto the hard gravel of an old creek bed jutting at right angles to his course. From the first he had intended to run towards the Morgans only to cover the true direction of his flight. And now, since the posse was hopelessly left behind him, well out of hearing, he rode Satan into the middle of the creek bed and swung him to the north. It was bad going for a horse carrying a rider, and even the cat-like certainty of Satan's tread could not avoid sharp edges here and there that might cut his hoofs. So Barry leaped to the ground and ran at full speed down the bed. Behind him, Satan followed, his ears pricked uneasily, and Black Bart, at a signal from the master, dropped back and remained at the first bend of the old empty stream. In a moment, they wound out of sight, even of Bart, but Barry kept steadily on. It would take a magnifying glass to read his trail over them rocks. He had covered a mile, perhaps, when Bart came scurrying again and leaped joyously around the master. They've hit the creek, huh?" said Whistlin Dan. "Well, they'll mill around a while, and like as not, they'll run a course south to pick me up again." He gestured towards the side, and as soon as Satan stood on the good going once more, Barry swung into the saddle and headed straight back to the west. No doubt the posse would ride up and down that creek until they found his trail running back, but they would lose precious minutes picking it up. And in the meantime, he'd be far, far away towards the ford of Tucker Creek. Then, clearly, but no louder than the snapping of a dry twig near his ear, he heard the report of a revolver, and it spoke to him of many things as the baffled posse rode up and down the creek bed hunting for the direction of his escape. Someone had fired that shot to relieve his anger. He neither spoke to Satan nor struck him, but there was a slight leaning forward, just an imperceptible flexing of the leg muscles, and in response, the black sprang again into the swift trot which sent him gliding over the ground, and twisting back and forth among the sharp-sided gullies with a movement as smooth as the run of the wolf dog, which once again raced ahead. When they came out in view of the rolling plain, Barry stopped again and glanced to the west, glanced to the north, while Black Bart ran to the top of the nearest hill and looked back, an ever-vigilant outpost. To the north lay the fordable streams near Caswell City, and that way was perfect safety, it seemed. Not perfect, perhaps, for Barry knew nothing of the telephones by which the little bald-headed clerk at the sheriff's office was rousing the countryside. But if he struck toward Caswell City from the Morgans, there was not a chance in 10 that scouts would catch him at the river, which was fordable for mile after mile. That way, then, lay the easiest escape, but it meant a long detour out of the shortest course, which struck almost exactly west, skirting dangerously close to Rickett. But, as Billy had presupposed, it was the very danger which lured the fugitive. Behind him, entangled in the gullies of the Badlands, were the 15 best men on the mountain desert. In front of him lay nothing except the mind of Billy the clerk. But how could he know that? Once again he swayed a little forward, and this time the stallion swung at once into his ranging gallop, then verged into a half-racing gait, for Barry wished to get out of sight among the rolling grounds before that posse came out from the Morgan Hills on his back trail. Chapter 31, The Trap. He had already covered a good 10 miles, a large part of that through extremely rough going, but that black ran with his head as high as the moment he pulled out of Rickett that very morning. There was only enough sweat to make his slender neck and greyhound flanks flash in the sun. Back he winged towards Rickett, running as freely as the wild leader of a herd, sometimes turning his fine head to one side to look back at the master or gaze over the hills, sometimes slackening to a trot up a sharper ascent or lengthening into a fuller gallop on an easy downslope. There seemed no purpose in the reins, which were kept just taut enough to give the rider the feel of his mount, and the left hand which held them was never still for a moment, but played back and forth slightly with the motion of the head. Except in times of crisis, those reins were not for the transmission of orders, it seemed, but they served as the wires through which the mind of the man and the mind of the horse kept in telegraphic touch. In the meantime, Black Bart loafed behind, lingering on the crest of each rise to look back, and then racing to catch up. But halfway back to Rickett, he came up beside the master whining and leaping as high as Barry's knee. "You seen something?" queried Barry. Are they coming on the trail again?" He swayed a bit to one side and diverted Satan out of his course so as to climb one of the more commanding swells. From this point he glanced back. He saw a dust cloud, much like that which a small whirlwind picks up, rolling down the nearest slope of the Morgan Hills. At that distance, the posse looked hardly larger than one unit, and certainly they could not see that single horseman they followed. However, they could follow the trail easily enough across the sand. Satan had turned to look back. "Shall we go back and play around 'em, boy?" asked Barry. Black Bart had run on ahead, and now he turned with a short howl. "Well, the partner says no," continued the master. "Of all the dogs I ever seed, Bart plays a more careful game. But out on the trail, Satan," here he sent the stallion into the sweeping lope, "Bart knows more than you and me put together, so we'll do what he says." For an answer, Satan lengthened a little into his stride. As for the wolf dog, he went off like a black bolt into the eye of the wind, streaking it west to hunt out the easiest course. A wolf. And surely there was more of a wolf than of a dog in Black Bart. Has a finer sense for the lay of ground than anything on 4 feet. He knows how to come down the wind on his quarry, keeping to the depressions and the ravines, so that not a taint of his presence is blown to the prey. And he will skulk across an open plain, stealing from hollow to hollow and stalking from bush to bush, so that the wariest, even the wariest, are taken by surprise. As for Black Bart, he knew the kind of going which the stallion liked as well, almost as he knew his own preferences, and he picked out a course which a surveyor would line with a spirit level could hardly have bettered. He wove across the country in loosely thrown semicircles, and came back in view of the master and the proper point. There was hardly much point in such industry in a country as smooth as this, not much mere difference, say, than the saving of a distance which the horse makes, who hugs the fence on the turn, and on account of that sticks his head under the finish wire, a nose in front. And Bart clung to his work with scrupulous care. Sometimes he ran back with lolling red tongue when the course lay clear, even to the duller sense of an animal, and frisked under the nose of Satan until a word from Barry sent him scurrying away like a pleased child. His duties comprehended not only the selection of the course, but also an eagle's vigilance before and behind, so that when he came back again with a peculiar whine, Barry leaned a little from the saddle and spoke to him anxiously. "Do you mean to say that they've been gaining ground on us, old boy?" Black Bart leapt sideways, keeping his head towards the master, and he howled in troubled fashion. "Whereaway are they now?" muttered Barry, and looked back again. A great distance behind, hardly distinguishable now, the dust of the posse was blending into the landscape and losing itself against the gray background. "Well, if they ain't nothing wrong behind us, what's biting you, Bart? You getting hungry, maybe? You want to hurry home?" Another howl, still louder, answered him. "Go on, then, and show me where there's trouble." Black Bart whirled and darted off almost straight ahead, but bearing up a hill slightly south of their course. And toward the top of this eminence he changed his lope for a skulking trot that brought his belly fur trailing on the ground. "They's something ahead of us, Satan," cried that master softly. "What could that be? It's men, by the way Bart sneaks up to look at him. They's nothing else that he'd do that way for. Easy, boy, and go soft." The stallion cut his gallop into a slinking trot, his head lowered, even his ears flat back, and glided up the hillside. Barry swung to the ground and crawled to the top of the hill. What he saw was a dozen mounted men swinging down into the low, broad scoop of ground beyond the hill. They raced with their hat brims standing stiff up in the wind. "Well, they've been watching us with glasses," whispered Dan to Bart, and the wolf dog snarled savagely, his neck fur ruffling up. The dozen directly in front were not all, for to the right, bearing straight across his original course, came another group almost as strong, and then to the left 8 more riders spurred at top speed. "Why, we almost walked into 'em," said Barry. "But they ain't got us yet. Back, boy." The wolf dog slunk down the hill until it was out of sight from the further side of the slope, and the master imitated these tactics until he was close to Satan. Once in the saddle, he made up his mind quickly. Someone in Rickett had guessed his intentions to double back toward Tucker Creek, and they had cut him off cleverly enough and in overwhelming force. However, no one in Rickett could guess that another way out remained for him in the fjords below Caswell City, and even if they knew, their knowledge would do them no good. They could not wing a message to that place to head him off. It was not humanly possible. For Dan knew nothing of the telephone lines which brought Caswell City itself within speaking distance of faraway Rickett. Caswell City, then, was his goal. But to get towards it, he must circle far back towards the Morgan Hills, back almost into the teeth of the posse in order to skirt around the right wing of these new enemies. And even then, to double that flank, he must send Satan ahead at full speed. As he swung around, the 8 men of that end party crashed over the hill 500 yards away, and their yell at the view of the quarry went echoing up the shallow valley. The slayer of Pete Glass, he who had done the notorious killing at Alder, was almost in touch of their revolvers, and their horses were fresh. Not one of that 8 but would have given odds on his chance of sharing the capture money. There was no spurs on the heels of Barry to urge Satan, no quirt in his hand, but a single word sent that black streaking down the hill. Going into the Morgan Hills he had gone like the wind, but now he rushed like a thoroughbred standing a challenge in the home stretch. His nose and his tail flying were not a straight line, and the flash of his legs was a tangle which no eye could follow as he shot east on the back trail, straight towards a posse. For a mile or more that speed did not slacken, and at that end of the distance he began to edge to the right. The men behind him knew well enough that the plan of the fugitive was, and they angled farther towards the north. And there in the distance came the posse, the cloud of dust breaking up now into the dark figures of the 15. And if the men from St. Vincent could hold that pace just a little longer, they would drive Barry between 2 fires. They flattened themselves along their horses' necks at infinite risk to their necks in case of a stumble, and every spur in the crowd was dripping red. Horseflesh could do no more, and still the black drew ahead inches and inches with every stride. If they could not turn him with their speed, another way remained, and by swift agreement, the 4 best horses were sent ahead at full speed while the other riders caught their reins over their pommels and jerked out their rifles. A quartet of bullets went screaming after that black horse. Indeed, there was a little chance that a place shot would go home, but their magazines were full, and a chance hit would do the work and kill both man and horse at that rate of speed. Now Dan Barry knew it, and when the bullets sang, he whirled in the saddle and swept out his rifle from its case in the same movement. The yellow devil of anger flared in his eyes as he pitched the butt to his shoulder, and straight into the circle of his sight rode Johnny Gasney of St. Vincent. Another volley whistled about him, and his finger trembled on the trigger. No chance work with Barry, for he knew the gait of Satan as a practiced naval gunner knows the swing of his ship in a smooth sea. And that circle of doom wavered over Johnny Gasney for a dozen strides before Dan turned with a faint moan and jammed that rifle back in its case. Once again he was balancing in his stirrups, leaning close to cut the wind with his shoulder. "I can't do it, Satan. I got nothing agin 'em. They think they're playing square. I can't do it. Stretch out, old boy, stretch out." It seemed impossible that the stallion could increase his exertions, but with that low voice in his ear, he did literally stretch along the ground and jerked himself away from the pursuit like a tall ship when a new sail spreads in a gale. The men from St. Vincent saw that the game was lost. Every one of the 8 had his rifle at the shoulder, and the bullets hissed everywhere about him. Right into his face, but a greater distance away, rode the posse from Rickett. The 15 tried men and true, and having caught the scheme of the trap, they were killing their horses with a last effort. It failed enough, no fault of theirs. Just as the jaws of the trap were about to close, the black stallion whisked out from danger, lunged over a swell of ground, and was out of view. When they reached that point, yelling, Barry raced his black out of range of all except the wildest chance shot. The 8 from St. Vincent drove their weapons sullenly into the holsters. For the last 5 minutes they'd been silently dividing $10,000 by 8, and the awakening left a taste of ashes. They could only follow him now at a moderate pace in the hope of wearing him down. And since a slight pause made little difference in the result, it would even be an advantage to breed their horses after that burst. They drew rein and cursed in a chorus. Chapter 32, Relays. Well, the horses from St. Vincent already wheezed from the run, but the mounts of the posse were staggering completely blown. Ever since they left Rickett, they had been going at close to top speed, and that last rush finished him. At least 7 of them chose 15 horses would never be worth their salt again. And they stood with hanging heads, bloody foam upon their breasts, and dripping from their mouths, their sides laboring, and breathing with that rattle which the rider dreads. The posse, to a man, swung sullenly to the ground. "Who's boss, boys?" called Johnny Gasney, puffing in his saddle as he rode up. "By God, we'll get him yet. They's a devil in that black hoss. Who's boss?" "I ain't exactly boss," answered Mark Retherton, whom not even fear of death could hurry in his ways of speech, "but maybe I can talk for the boys. What you want, Johnny?" "You gents'll be needing new hosses." "We'll be needing graves for the ones we got," growled Mark, and he stared gloomily at the dull eyes of his pinto. "The best cutting out hoss I ever throwed a leg over. And now, look at him." "Well, here's your relay," cut in Johnny Gasney. "Old Billy's phoned down. 5 men came leading 3 spare horses apiece. He phoned down and asked me to get 15 hosses ready. He must have guessed we're buried ahead, and well, here they are, the best ponies in St. Vincent, and by God's sake, use 'em better than you did that set." The other members of the posse set to work silently changing their saddles to the new relay, and Mark Retherton tossed his answers over his shoulder to Johnny Gasney while he drew his cinch brutally tight. "They's a pile of hoss flesh in these parts, but they ain't more'n one Barry. You gents can say goodbye to your hosses unless we nail him before they're run down." Johnny Gasney rubbed his fat, red forehead, perplexed. "It's all right," he decided, "'cause it ain't possible. That black hoss can outlast these, but he sure seemed full of running. One thing more, Mark, you don't need to fear pressing Barry, 'cause he won't shoot. He had his gun out, but I guess he don't want to run up the score any higher than it is. He put it back without firing a shot. Go on, boys, and go like hell. Billy has lined up a new relay for you at Wago." They made no pause to start in a group, but each one sent home the spurs just as soon as he was in the saddle. They had ridden for the blood of Pete Glass before, but now at least 7 of them rode for the sake of the horses they'd ruined, and to a cowpuncher, a favorite mount is as dear as a friend. They expected to find the black out of sight, but it was a welcome surprise to see him not more than half a mile away wading across St. Vincent Creek. For Barry quite accurately guessed that there would be a pause in the pursuit after that hair-breadth escape, and at the creek he stopped to let Satan get his wind. He would not trust that stallion to drink, but gave him a bare mouthful from his hat and loosened the cinches for an instant. Not that this was absolutely necessary, for Satan was neither blown nor leg-weary. He stood dripping with sweat, indeed, but poised lightly, his head high, his ears pricked, his nostrils distended to transparency as he drew in great breath. Even that interval Barry used, for he set to work vigorously massaging the muscles of shoulders and hips and whipping off the sweat from neck and flank. It was several moments, and already Satan's breath came easily. Then Black Bart shot down from his watch post and warned them with a snarl, but still, before he tightened the cinches again and climbed to the saddle, Barry took that fine head of the stallion between his hands. "Between you and me, Satan," he murmured, "our day's work is just beginning. Are you feeling fit?" Satan nuzzled the shoulder of the master and snorted his answer. Black Bart had given the warning, and the stallion was eager to be off. They crossed the creek at a place where the stones came almost to the surface, since nothing is more detrimental to the speed of a horse than a plunge in cold water. And with the hoofbeats of the posse growing up behind, they cantered off again a little casted north, straight for Caswell City. There was little work for Black Bart in such country as this, for there was rarely a rise of ground over which a man on horseback could not look, and the surface was racetrack fast. And once Satan knew the direction, there was nothing for it but to sit the saddle and let him work. And he fell into his long-distance gait. It was a smart pace for any ordinary animal to follow through a half-day's journey. And Barry, he knew with perfect certainty that there was not the slightest chance of even the fresh horses behind him wearing down Satan before nighttime. But to his astonishment, the trailers rode as if they had limitless horseflesh at their command. Perhaps they were unaware of the running that was still in Satan. So Barry sent the stallion on at a free gallop that shunted the sagebrush past him in a dizzy whirl. A mile of this, but when he looked back, the posse were even closer. God, they were riding still with the spur. It was madness, but it was not his part to worry for them, and it was necessary that he maintain at least this interval. So he leaned just a little forward to cut the wind more easily, and Satan leaped into a faster pace. He had several distinct advantages over the mounts of the posse. At their customary rolling lope, they will travel all day with hardly a break, but they have neither the size nor the length of leg for sustained bursts of speed. Moreover, most of the cow ponies who now raced on the trail of Satan carried riders who outweighed Barry by 20 pounds or more, and in addition to this, they were burdened by saddles made ponderously to stand the strains of roping cattle, whereas Barry's specially made saddle was hardly half that weight. Perhaps more than all this, the cow ponies rode by compulsion, urged on with sharp spurs, checked and guided by the jaw-breaking curb, whereas Satan frolicked along at his own will, or at least at the will of a master which was one with his. No heavy bit worried his mouth. No pointed steel tormented his flanks. He had only one handicap, the weight of his rider, and that weight was balanced and distributed with the care of a perfect horseman. With all this in mind, it was hardly wonderful that the stallion kept that posse easily in play. His breathing was a trifle harder now, and perhaps there was not quite the same light spring in his gallop, but Barry, looking back, could tell by the tossing heads of the horses which followed that they were quickly being run down to their last gasp. Mile after mile there was not a pause in that murderous pace, and then, cutting the sky with a row of sharp-pointed hooves, he saw a town straight ahead and groaned in understanding. It was rather new country to Barry, but the posse must know it like a book. They were spending their horses freely because they hoped to arrange for a fresh series of mounts in Wago. However, it would take some time for them to arrange the details of the loan, and by that time he would be out of sight among the hills which stretched ahead. That would give him a sufficient start, and he'd make the fords near Caswell City comfortable enough. At Caswell City, indeed, they might get a still other relay, but just beyond the Asper River rose the Grizzly Peaks, his own country, and once among them he could laugh the posse to scorn. He patted Satan on the shoulder and swept on at a redoubled speed, skirting close to the town, while the posse plunged straight into it. Listen closely. He could hear their shouts as they entered the village, could mark the cessation of their hoofbeats. 10 minutes, 5 minutes for at least for the change of horses, and that time would put him safely among the hills. But the impossible happened. There was no pause of minutes, hardly a pause of seconds, when the rush of hoofbeats began again and poured out from the town. 15 desperate riders on 15 fresh mounts. By some miracle, Wago had been warned, and the needed horses had been kept there saddled and ready for the relay. It turned an easy escape into a close chance, but still, his faith in Satan was boundless to reach the fords in time, and the safety of the mountains beyond. Another word, and with a snort that great-hearted stallion swept up the slope, with Black Bart at his old work, skirting ahead and choosing the easiest way. That was another great handicap in favor of the fugitive, and every advantage counted with redoubled significance now, every foot of distance saved, every inch of climb avoided. A new obstacle confronted him, for the low, rolling hills were everywhere checked with squares and oblongs of plowed ground, freshly turned and guarded by tall fences of barbed wire. Now they could be jumped, but jumping was no easy matter for a tiring horse, and Barry saw, with a sigh of relief, a sharp gulch to the left, which cut straight through that region of broken farms and headed north and east, pointing like an arrow in the direction of the fords. He swung down into it without a thought and pressed on. The bottom, it was gravelly here and there from the effects of the water, which once washed through the ravine, cut these sides so straight. But over the greater part of the bottom sand had drifted, and the going was hardly worse than the hilly stretches above. The sides grew higher now, and with great rapidity. Already they were up to the shoulder of Satan, and now up to his withers. And from behind, the roar of the posse racing at full speed filled that gulch with confusion of echoes. They must be racing their horses as if they was entering the home stretch. Why, as if they were sure of the goal. It was strange. Well, now, what's he going to do? Is he going to make it across this river? Or they got him in the hole? Sounds like they got him all wound up in a trap, don't it, folks? Good Lord. Well, we'll be reading more of this story next time I see you. And next time I see you, we'll be around this same campfire. We'll just be warming and laughing and having a drink or two and catching up on things, old friends. Until then, well, you all have a good evening and be careful with your lives. And I'll see you next time around the campfire. This is Clay Steele. Good night.